neon glow of the city pulsed against the rain-slicked streets, casting long, distorted reflections on the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a lone, lingering note in the symphony of late-night chaos. The air smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke, the kind of night that felt like a secret waiting to be told. Adrian adjusted his tie, his fingers lingering over the knot a second too long. A habit, or maybe just a hesitation. The lobby of the Sterling Tower was eerily quiet at this hour, the security guard barely glancing up from his magazine as Adrian strode past. A sleek black card slid effortlessly through the scanner, granting him access to the executive elevator. He stepped inside, the metallic doors hissing shut, sealing him in. He checked his reflection in the mirrored walls. Sharp suit, polished shoes, every inch the man in control. And yet, beneath the veneer of confidence, there was something else. A tension in his jaw. A flicker of something unreadable in his own eyes. The elevator ascended, smooth and soundless, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in his mind. He had spent years perfecting discipline, shaping himself into the man he was now. The kind of man who never let emotions dictate actions. But tonight was different. As the doors slid open, he stepped into the dimly lit hallway of the top floor. The scent of rich mahogany and aged whiskey lingered in the air. A single light glowed from the corner office at the end of the hall. Inside, waiting for him, was the only person who had ever truly known him. Elliot sat behind the massive oak desk, his fingers drumming lazily against the wood. His gaze lifted as Adrian entered, sharp eyes scanning him like a puzzle he had already solved. "You're late," Elliot said, his voice smooth but edged with something unreadable. Adrian exhaled slowly, stepping forward. "Traffic," a smirk. "Right, because traffic stops you." A beat of silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain hit the windows in rhythmic patterns, a soft metronome to the tension in the room. "You called," Adrian said finally, crossing his arms. "I assume it's important." Elliot leaned back, studying him. "You tell me, you've been slipping, Adrian, losing your grip. And I don't mean just in business." Something cold curled in Adrian's stomach, but his face remained unreadable. "What are you talking about?" Elliot tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Discipline, control, the thing you built your entire life around. I used to admire it." He paused. "Now, I wonder if it was ever real at all." Adrian clenched his jaw. "I don't have time for games." Elliot chuckled, standing. He walked to the bar cart, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. He held one out. Adrian didn't take it. "You should," Elliot said, swirling the amber liquid. "Because this game, it's already begun. And you're not the one holding the pieces anymore." Adrian felt it then, the shift. The undercurrent of something dangerous threading its way through the air. The normalcy of the evening, the casual conversation, it had all been a prelude, a carefully constructed illusion. And now, standing in this office, staring into the eyes of the one person he had always trusted, Adrian knew one thing for certain. He was about to be betrayed. Adrian had always been good at reading people, but tonight, Elliot was an enigma. There was something unsettling in the way he spoke, like a man who already knew the outcome of the conversation. The power dynamic had shifted, and Adrian hated it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Enough riddles, Elliot. If you have something to say, say it." Elliot studied him for a long moment, then set his whiskey glass down with a deliberate clink. "Do you remember what we built, Adrian? What we sacrificed?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Of course I do." "Then tell me." Elliot's voice softened, almost a whisper, but there was steel beneath it. "Why you're trying to burn it all down?" Adrian's pulse skipped. His mind raced through possibilities. Had Elliot found out? Had someone talked? No, impossible. He had been careful. "I don't know what you're talking about," Adrian said evenly. Elliot sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Lying to me? That's beneath you." He turned, walking toward a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled open a drawer, sifting through papers. "I had my doubts," he continued. "But then, Something interesting crossed my desk. Adrian's muscles tensed. Elliot was toying with him. You always had discipline, Adrian. Control is what made you dangerous. Elliot glanced at him. But lately, you've been slipping. Adrian forced a smirk. You think I'm slipping because I'm not hanging on to every word you say? Elliot's laugh was quiet, but it held no humor. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Read it. Adrian picked it up, his stomach twisting before his eyes even focused on the words. It was a bank statement. His account. Large withdrawals all routed through unfamiliar shell companies. Transactions he had never made. This was a setup. Adrian's grip tightened on the paper. Where did you get this? Elliot leaned forward, voice dripping with mock concern. More importantly, Adrian. Who else has seen it? Adrian looked up, meeting Elliot's gaze. There it was, the trap. Elliot wasn't showing him this out of curiosity. He had already made up his mind. You did this, Adrian said, his voice low. You're framing me. Elliot sighed dramatically, shaking his head. I don't need to frame you, Adrian. You've already done that yourself. A beat of silence. Then Elliot spoke again, quieter. They're watching. Adrian stiffened. You think I'm the only one who's noticed your little distractions? Elliot's voice was smooth, laced with quiet menace. The board is asking questions. The investors are getting nervous. And if I were you, I'd be very, very careful about what I say next. Adrian's mind worked at lightning speed. This wasn't just a warning. It was an ultimatum. You're cutting me out, Adrian said slowly. Elliot tilted his head. I'm giving you an option. Either you fix this, clean up your mess, or I will. And if I do, he smiled. Well, you won't like how that plays out. Adrian forced his expression into one of detached amusement, even as his pulse hammered. So that's what this is. Power move. Elliot's smirk didn't fade. Call it whatever you want. Adrian exhaled through his nose, his mind already calculating. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. Fine, he said. I'll handle it. Elliot studied him. Good. Adrian turned, walking toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, Elliot's voice stopped him cold. Oh, and Adrian? He turned back. Elliot smiled. I'd watch my back if I were you. The rain had slowed by the time Adrian stepped out of the building, but the air was thick with the weight of the night's events. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he had hoped never to use. A woman's voice answered after the first ring. You never call. Adrian exhaled sharply. I need information. Now. A pause. Then, how bad? He glanced back at the Sterling Tower, its glass windows reflecting the city lights like a house of mirrors. Bad. The warehouse was empty, save for the hum of a flickering overhead light and the rhythmic drip of water leaking from a rusted pipe. Adrian stood near the center, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, fingers wrapped around the small knife he always carried. Elliot was late. Or maybe he wasn't coming at all. Adrian's jaw clenched. No, Elliot wanted him here. This was a game, a power play, and Adrian had walked straight into it. The sound of footsteps echoed off the cold concrete walls. Slow, unhurried, Adrian turned. Elliot emerged from the shadows, his suit impeccable despite the damp chill of the warehouse. His smile was relaxed, almost amused. You came, Elliot said. You gave me no choice, Adrian replied. Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. You always have a choice. You just make the wrong ones. Adrian's grip on the knife tightened. Let's not do this, Elliot. Just tell me what you want. Elliot's gaze darkened. I want what I've always wanted, control, stability. But you've become unpredictable, reckless. Adrian exhaled through his nose, fighting the urge to lunge. You framed me. You set this all up. Elliot took a step forward, his voice calm, almost gentle. You did that to yourself, Adrian. I just gave you a little push. The rage in Adrian's chest ignited like a lit fuse. You were my friend. Elliot sighed. That was your first mistake. Thinking this was ever about friendship. A door creaked open behind them. Adrian's shoulders tensed. More footsteps. He turned slightly, catching the movement in his peripheral vision. 3 men. No 4. Suits like Elliot. Clean cut. Cold eyes. A trap. Adrian took a step back, his mind racing. He could take 1, maybe 2, but 4? Elliot smirked. You should have known it would end like this. Adrian's pulse roared in his ears. You think I'm just going to let you do this? Elliot tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. Adrian, you don't have a choice anymore. And then, a sharp, searing pain exploded in Adrian's side. His breath caught. The knife in his hand slipped from his fingers, clattering to the ground. He staggered, eyes wide, hands instinctively pressing against his ribs. Warm blood seeped through his coat, pooling against his palm. He turned, disoriented, and saw her, Lena. Her eyes, ones he had once trusted, once loved, were steady, cold. The blade in her hand dripped red. Adrian's world tilted. Betrayal burned hotter than the pain in his body. Lena, his voice was barely a whisper. She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. I warned you, Adrian. You stopped listening. Adrian's knees buckled, but he caught himself against a stack of crates. His vision blurred at the edges. Why, he choked out. Lena's gaze flickered, just for a second, before she composed herself. Because Elliot always wins. Elliot clapped his hands together. She's smarter than you ever gave her credit for. Adrian's breath was ragged, his body screaming for relief, but the pain didn't matter. Not compared to this. You used me, he rasped. Lena's jaw tightened. I did what I had to. Elliot stepped beside her, his hand resting on her back like a reward. Good girl, he murmured. Adrian saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Just for a moment. But it was too late. His vision swam, his body weakening. His fingers curled into a fist, but there was nothing left to fight for. As darkness clawed at the edges of his consciousness, he let out a breathless, bitter laugh. He had lost. The city moved on as it always did. Adrian's name flickered across news headlines for a few days, buried beneath financial scandals and political drama. Businessman found dead in warehouse. Suspected criminal ties? That's all he had been reduced to. A headline. Passing scandal. Elliot had seen to that. He stood in his office, high above the city, watching the streets below as rain streaked against the glass. The same city that once belonged to Adrian. Now it was his. Lena sat across from him, silent. She had been that way ever since that night. You're brooding, Elliot said, pouring himself a drink. Lena didn't respond. Come on, he coaxed. We did what had to be done. Adrian was reckless, weak. If we hadn't acted, he would have brought everything down with him. Still, she said nothing. Elliot studied her. Tell me you don't regret it. Lena's fingers curled into her lap. I don't. It was a lie. A well-practiced one. Elliot smiled. Good. But she did regret it. She regretted the way Adrian had looked at her in those final moments. Like she had torn the very ground from beneath him. She regretted the way his voice had cracked when he asked why. She regretted the way she had hesitated before driving the knife in. The world didn't care, though. Elliot had spun the story before the blood had even dried. Adrian was a traitor, a liability. His death had been inevitable. And Lena? She was nothing more than a loyal partner. A woman who had been forced to act for the sake of the business. That's how the press saw it. The funeral had been small. Adrian's sister had stood at the gravesite, her face blank, her hands clenched into fists. No cameras had been allowed, no reporters lurking. Just the few who had still cared. Lena hadn't gone. She had watched from a distance, hidden behind tinted glass as the casket was lowered into the ground. Elliot had told her not to bother with guilt. It's just wasted energy, he had said. But she did feel it. It followed her in the quiet moments, in the dead of night when the world was still, and there was no one left to lie to. She had killed Adrian. And for what? Elliot's approval? Power? Lena turned away from the city skyline, pressing her palms against her temples. She had told herself this was the right thing, that she had done what was necessary. So why did it feel like she had lost something she could never get back? Elliot, sensing the shift in her, exhaled. "You're thinking too much again." Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you ever really care about him?" Elliot didn't hesitate. "No." The answer stung, though it shouldn't have. Lena nodded once, pushing back the nausea creeping into her chest. She had made her choice. Now she had to live with it.